Welcome to the Autism Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Janine Hershkovitz, and it's my goal to help you create a more peaceful home while living with autistic and neurodivergent loved ones. Each episode, we focus on a different room in the house and help you create a peace plan for your home. So let's get started. Well, welcome, friends. In this episode of the Autism Blueprint Podcast, we are in the bathroom today. That's right, the bathroom, where we spend an inordinate amount of time with our kiddos, helping them with some of the major issues of daily living skills. One of them being pooping, or to use my guest's language, stools, gut motility, and psychobiotics. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Noelle Patno, a leading expert in the field of molecular metabolism and nutrition, and the chief scientific officer of Bened Life. Our conversation delved deep into the fascinating and complex relationship between the gut and the brain, particularly in the context of autism. We kicked things off by hearing about Dr. Patno's personal story, which is truly inspiring, and how her experience with her own health helped shape her mission to help others and navigate their health journeys. We also talked about the gut-brain connection, a topic that resonates with so many of us as parents of autistic children who often notice the gastrointestinal issues. Dr. Patno explained what the gut biome is, how these tiny microorganisms can have a big impact on both our physical and mental health. And we discussed the importance of a balanced diet, focusing on whole foods, Mediterranean diets, and clearing up some common misconceptions about certain food groups. One of the standout points of our chat was the prevalence of gastrointestinal problems in autistic individuals and how these can show up in various behaviors and symptoms. Dr. Patno emphasized the need for a holistic approach to treatment, considering everything from diet to lifestyle and the unique microbiome of each person. We discussed the exciting world of probiotics, particularly PS128, which is a strain developed by Bened Life. Dr. Patno shared some fascinating research that suggests PS128 might help reduce anxiety and improve communication in autistic children. As we wrapped up, Dr. Patno reminded us of the importance of consulting healthcare professionals when considering dietary changes or supplements, especially for those that are already on medications. She shared some heartwarming testimonials from individuals who have seen some real benefits from PS128, including a touching story about a non-speaking autistic adult who experienced significant improvements in his life. So definitely listen for that at the end. The episode is packed with valuable insights for parents, caregivers, and anyone curious about the gut-brain connection and its implications for autism. There's a lot of information out there on this topic, you guys, so I wanted to find an expert whose expertise and passion for helping others really shines through. This is a must listen for anyone looking to understand that intricate relationship between diet, gut health, and mental well-being. So without further ado, here's Dr. Patno. Well, Dr. Noelle Patno, thank you for being on the Autism Blueprint Podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me, Janine.
Great to have you here. So I always like to start out with our guests telling us a little bit about how you got where you are today. Tell us a little bit about your background and what got you here.
I was very interested in math and science, but I think after being in an engineering job for a while, I had my own personal health experience, and I really did not want to do adjuvant chemotherapy after having colon cancer removed from my intestine. So I did my own research. I went to complementary doctors, and I was also exploring graduate school at that time. So ultimately, I found ways to support myself in a dietary management perspective. And I obtained my PhD in molecular metabolism and nutrition, and then went on to work on finding ways to support dietary therapies for other people dealing with conditions that don't necessarily have the best options in the medical world.
Yeah, absolutely. Which sounds very similar to a lot of our journeys as autism parents. You know, when we realize our kiddos have a lot of intestinal issues and gut issues and food sensitivities. It tends to be a similar journey. So I love that a struggle, well, I don't love it for you, but a struggle that came into your life, you've turned it into something to help other people. I think that's just amazing.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's just really important to be aware of the pros and cons of any treatment, and if something is, has a very small percentage of having a benefit, but you're concerned about side effects and long-term outcomes, then it's really important to look into options and educate yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned, and I think this is a good place to start, changing your diet. What kinds of things have you learned as a result of that? Both, I'd love to know what changes you made and then what changes you see that are helpful for other people.
Yes. Well, I think one thing that's kind of funny that I didn't change that some people might expect was a lot of people think about, red meat maybe being bad for you with colon cancer. And I think I ate a steak like maybe a week after my surgery. But it's so important to get the protein you need. And there's even conjugated linoleic acid in grass-fed meat that can be so good for you. So I don't think that necessarily eliminating certain foods can be good, especially when you look in the literature and it's maybe more of the nitrates or the nitrites or different things that can be in the processed meats that are associated with cancer. So I focused more on the Mediterranean diet, and that has really had the most evidence in the literature for many conditions, for prevention of many chronic diseases. And I think that's pretty widespread across many conditions, just looking at whole foods, plant-based foods. I did do juicing for a little while, but this was over 10 years ago. So now it's really more about, getting the right fiber, getting the variety of vegetables, getting adequate protein, obviously fish, omega-3 containing fish, like fatty salmons, and avoiding a lot of the additives that are in processed foods. So trying to have foods that aren't highly processed, and supporting a healthy gut microbiome as well.
Nice. So what I hear you saying is it's not necessarily meat that was the issue for you with colon cancer. It's the way that it's prepared, preserved, the extras that we put into food. I think that really helps clarify it because there's so many different therapeutic diets out there, particularly shopped to autism parents. And some of them work for some kids and some of them don't really do anything. So, it's definitely not a one size fits all, as I'm sure you've seen in your research. Tell us, you mentioned gut microbiome. Tell us, for those that don't know, what is that? What are you talking about when you say that?
Yeah, so gut microbiome would refer to the microbes in your gut. So that would be bacteria, it could be yeast, fungi, those tiny microorganisms that are on the micro scale. And when we say microbiome, we're referring to also the genes and all of those microbiota. So microbiota would just be microorganisms, but microbiome would be the genes and those organisms, because most of the literature characterizes the gut microbiome by its genes to identify what's there. And so that's why we usually say gut microbiome.
Okay. So, for those of us that don't have medical degrees, I just wanted to clarify. Are you saying that your genes can be affected by microbiome?
Well, genes can be affected by the microbiome, but I was just trying to distinguish the difference between gut microbiome and gut microbiota there, where when we analyze somebody's gut microbiome, we're looking at the genes of the bacteria and the yeast and the fungi in the gut. And usually when you say gut microbiome, most people assume you're talking about the bacteria in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we do it is by looking at the DNA in the feces and sequencing the bacteria DNA in the feces to find out, oh, what's in your gut microbiome? It's bacteria. Usually we're looking at the genes of the bacteria in your gut.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never knew that. So that what you're actually looking for is not just the presence of them, but you're looking at their DNA.
Right. That's the easiest way to identify them.
Oh, how cool. I had no idea. And is that usually, not to get graphic, but we are talking about the gut, so we're probably going to talk about poop.
Yes.
Yeah, is that done through a stool test?
Yes. And I think it's interesting to, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but you could look at the stool is what we excrete, right? So there's going to be dead microbes, there are going to be live microbes, and it might not necessarily reflect what's actually on the mucosa, which is the lining of the intestine. So it's much harder, obviously, to have people accept a colonoscopy or some kind of procedure where scientists or researchers would go in and obtain samples of fecal matter or luminal matter inside the intestine to look at the bacteria that's in there at that moment in time. Because as it passes through the gut and outside the gut, the stool microbiome may be different. Like the small intestinal microbiome is different from the large intestinal microbiome. And at the top of the intestinal wall versus like inside those little crypts, the little villi in the intestine, you may have variation in the populations of bacteria. So it can get pretty complicated if you get really deep into it. There was a funny study where they put a straw into a stool sample and they looked at, oh, are there differences in the microbes, deep into the sample versus the top? And so to try to mitigate those effects, they might just blend the whole sample and then try to take a sample of that.
Ah, that's really, thank you for explaining that. As as visually uninviting as that is in my brain, it's very informative because there are so many times where, I've heard of people having a colonoscopy and being told, "Oh, you're fine." But there's so much intestine that they can't necessarily always get to.
Mm.
And then I've also read that there are microbes that are kind of hiding in those, in that mucosa that's in the gut lining. Talk a little bit about that and how that can affect people.
Well, first of all, in a colonoscopy, usually they're prepped colonoscopies, which means that the person has taken large amounts of laxatives to flush the whole system and clean it up. So it's a lot easier for the gastroenterologist to go in and look for whatever they're looking at. It might be early colon cancer screening. It might be inflammatory bowel disease screening, looking for inflamed mucosa, etc. So ideally, if you really did want to look at the gut microbiome, you would have an unprepped colonoscopy, which would be incredibly messy. And and yes, there can be differences, like I said, in the microbial populations in the crypts, where because the intestine, as you know, is not necessarily perfectly flat. There's these villi that helps with absorption in the small intestine of nutrients and such. And there are also, for example, maybe this will be easier for people to connect to. People have probably heard of Akkermansia. Akkermansia is a genus. There's a species, Mucinophila. So many people maybe have heard of Akkermansia mucinophila. Mucinophila means mucus loving. And so Akkermansia mucinophila actually is a type of bacteria that loves your intestinal mucus. So it's right next to your intestinal mucus, whereas some other bacteria might just be floating, or maybe not necessarily floating, but might be a little bit more removed from the intestine.
Okay, gotcha. And thank you for going down that rabbit hole with me. I just always find it, and I know that my audience finds it interesting to understand kind of what it is we're talking about and that it's really, really complicated. So let's kind of take that and talk about how these microbes affect people as far as kids with autism in particular? What are some of the behaviors that you see or symptoms that you see that tell you that a microbiome might be off kilter?
Well, the microbiome has been associated with so many different conditions and behaviors. I think you can look at population studies to say, okay, the gut microbiome is different in autistic individuals versus people who don't have an autism diagnosis. There isn't really a universal test for the gut microbiome that we would all agree on that could establish, okay, you have a balanced gut microbiome, right? Or yours is off balance. Is usually people might have symptoms that they would hypothesize, oh, maybe I have something wrong with my gut microbiome. And things that are most obvious would be, an oviparasite test or something where you could look for a specific pathogen. And that's very, very obvious and more well established and recognized that, okay, there's a problem there. But less obvious would be maybe some commensals. By commensals, I mean friendly bacteria that may be existing in your gut that for many individuals, they don't seem to be a problem, but they're what some people call potentially pathogenic, right? And so that could be associated with gut issues. Now, as you probably already know, gastrointestinal problems often exist at like 3 to 4 times higher incidence in autistic people than people who don't have an autism diagnosis. And that could be associated with the gut microbiome. It could also be associated with neurological differences in the gut or a variety of other things, such as restricted eating behaviors that many autistic people may have because of sensory challenges with eating certain types of foods. And then because there's that lack of a variety of the foods, there's a lack of support for the gut microbiome and for the health of the intestine. So it really, I think, gets to what are the extraintestinal symptoms, extraintestinal pathologies, perhaps. Like you could say, okay, is there gut pain? Is there diarrhea? Is there constipation? And then you could look, well, do we need to look at a gut microbiome test? Do we need to look at what are the dietary behaviors? Do we need to look at something else? There are lifestyle behaviors too, right? Exercise, sleep. There are so many things that have also been associated with altering the gut microbiome as well, and associated with intestinal motility, even just the timing of when you eat your food. So it can get pretty complicated, and that's why working with a good clinician can help in that respect. And the gut microbiome test might not always be necessary in many cases.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the most confusing parts with my own son. He's an adult now, but he had chronic constipation all of his life, and also got the motility issues, the ability to get it out. And it was all the above, right? It was the sensory issues, it was the microbiome, it was the diet, it was pretty much everything. So once we attacked it from all sides, then that got better. I think it's just so hard to figure out what's causing what. So where would you start if you had a kiddo like mine, say with chronic constipation and just not sure? How would you begin?
That's a great question. I'm not actually a clinician, so I don't treat patients. I have a PhD in molecular metabolism and nutrition, so I'm more on the let's design and create research studies to try to answer some challenging questions. I think working with a clinician who could do a full inventory. I've been to some functional medicine training classes through Institute for Functional Medicine, for example, and I've talked to doctors. So I would imagine that they would, that a good functional medicine doctor or a good doctor in general would take the full inventory, full history, even looking at environmental exposures. You could look at mold exposure, dietary history, family history, getting that full history first, right? And then understanding the full picture and then then usually a clinician would look at, okay, what other tests or information do I need to collect before making some type of diagnosis and treatment plan.
Okay. And so the products that you've been helpful in creating are things that, like, I've heard of probiotics, right? So I think all of our listeners have probably talked about prebiotics and probiotics. They know what we're talking about. When we talk about psychobiotics and postbiotics and something called symbiotics, can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Sure, absolutely. These terms may be used differently, especially in popular media, but the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, or ISAP, has actually come out with formal consensus document definitions for each of those terms. First of all, probiotics are live microorganisms that, when consumed at adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. So notice they have to be living. They could be bacteria or yeast. They have to be at a certain amount because a sufficient amount needs to be acquired to have an effect. They also need to confer a health benefit, right? That's part of the definition. So that could mean reducing diarrhea. It could mean, improving constipation. It also could mean reducing anxiety. Now, psychobiotics has been defined as, not by ISAP, but by a different group of scientists, but as basically probiotics that help in psychiatric conditions or help in mental health or neurological health areas. So those would be the ones that maybe reduce anxiety or help with certain mood or movement and neurological related aspects, behavior perhaps. Prebiotics are, some people think that's like food for the bacteria. Prebiotics are technically substrates that confer a health benefit on the host. I might be missing a couple of technical words for that definition, but you could think of inulin as a good example of a prebiotic that's been demonstrated. It's providing that substrate to the bacteria that's already in your gut, and then the bacteria already in your gut metabolize it, and by doing so, the host has a health benefit, whether that's improving constipation or inulin apparently improves also calcium absorption. So a 2' fucosyllactose could be relevant. That's a human milk oligosaccharide. That's in human breast milk. That's also a prebiotic that impacts the gut microbiome. And then postbiotics, another term. Postbiotics are inactivated microbes and or their components that can then confer a health benefit on the host. So you could think about that as maybe dead probiotics or dead microbes. So they don't actually have to be probiotics when they're alive. You could have some dead microbes that when they were alive weren't probiotics, but when they're inactivated, so that they might be heat treated, they might be sonicated, but essentially they're not alive anymore. And their components or their metabolites might be having the influence on certain cell signaling or helping with stress reduction or whatever the health benefit is. So from Bened Life, because you mentioned, where I work, we have a probiotic we call PS128 because that's the specific strain. You should probably get into naming conventions then. So lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, you may have heard of these. These are examples of genre or genus. So lactobacillus is a genus. And then a species would be something like acidophilus, rhamnosus, plantarum in this case. So lactobacillus plantarum, that gives you the genus and species name. They recently changed, lactobacillus was this huge genus. It was so big that they divided it up into many other genera, like 25 or so, I believe. And so now it's Lactoplantibacillus plantarum. And that's Lactoplantibacillus plantarum PS128. And the reason this is important is specific strains of probiotics have specific effects. It's been shown when you look at all of the literature. Some might help in certain conditions while the others don't help in those conditions. For example, I think it's MF1298. There's a specific L plantarum MF1298, I believe, that was tested in IBS that didn't help. But then there was 299V, which is another L plantarum strain, which helped in IBS in some studies, but not in others. So it's really important to know which strain it is that you're talking about for probiotic and which condition it's been tested in, and then if a benefit has been observed.
I'm getting the idea that the gut and all of this microbiology is similar to like exploring space or exploring the ocean, where it's just the more you learn, the more, like you were saying, they had to come up with more names for more organisms, and it's just fascinating. Is that true? Is it kind of the more you're uncovering, the more is you're discovering?
Yes, there are trillions of bacteria in your gut. So I think
Okay.
this is going to be an area of research for as long as life will exist.
Yeah.
And, many of them you cannot culture. So they require anaerobic conditions, which means you have to grow them in some kind of chamber that doesn't have any oxygen. And that can be very expensive and difficult to grow them. Like I mentioned, Akkermansia muciniphila earlier, it has to be raised in an anaerobic chamber.
Mhm. Wow. So the complications of this are it's just dawning on me that we could have a lot of diseases in the world that could be remedied by fixing the gut. Is that accurate?
That's what many people believe. I mean, there's
Yeah.
the trope or cliche or however you want to say it. The idea that all health starts in the gut. I mean, what we're consuming, some people believe you are what you eat, but there's also you are what you think. There's also mind over matter. So we do need to pay attention to the influence of what we're eating, and we're taking in microbes in our food too, and how what we're eating and what probiotics we're ingesting is then going to impact how we feel, and that might influence how we behave.
Okay, so for example, the way that I would understand that, and tell me if I'm on the right track, is if I eat a lot of sugar, I'm going to be feeding the bugs that I don't want more of. For example, maybe yeast, a lot of them that feed on the sugar, that overgrows. And then I have found I get foggy. My brain gets foggy. Is that a good example?
Yeah, I would say that many functional medicine practitioners would say what you're talking about is, using sugar, and that might drive candidiasis because candida loves sugar. So that's quite possible.
Okay, fascinating. You mentioned before something about a one of the strains in our gut, or one of the bacteria in our gut, linked to anxiety. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How do we treat anxiety by treating the gut?
I think, first of all, what's really interesting to bring out from the literature regarding anxiety is that there was a study showing transfer of fecal microbes from depressed humans into mice actually led to a depression-like behavior in those mice. So you can see how important, first of all, those microbes are. Now, when you get into the specific details, which microbes are causing that, I'm not sure that we know that exactly, but we attack it sort of from the other angle. Which probiotics could we take? I mean, you could also, think which prebiotics or what diet could I have, but which probiotics could I take that could support my mood or, reduce that anxiety? And you could also look at, well, which microbes are lower in anxious people versus in non-anxious people. We have specifically at Bennett Life looked at the PS128 probiotic that I told you about earlier, and its effect in reducing anxiety in autistic children. The strongest evidence was in a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial. The children were pretty young. They enrolled 2.5 to 7-year-olds. And that's where they saw the significant effect on the reduction in anxiety, a subscale score in autistic children. But there were 3 other clinical trials that weren't designed the same way, but reflect that finding that PS128 may support reduction in anxiety in some autistic individuals.
Wow, that's fascinating. Um, I'm wondering by the same token, attention span. So when we talk about anxiety, I feel like in our kids, when the anxiety is lowered, attention span is better, right? And I'm just thinking about the brain and how it works. And once we're not stuck in that fight or flight place, we can then use our prefrontal cortex more effectively. So that's how I understand it from a brain, like from a neuroscience perspective. Tell me about that gut brain connection and learning and attention span and all of that.
Yes, sure. So you're talking about the gut brain axis. You brought up some great examples there. The gut microbiome can communicate with the brain through the gut brain axis in a variety of ways by interacting with the nerve endings on the end of the vagus nerve and transmitting signals across the vagus nerve, by producing metabolites or interacting with cells that then send signals or even send hormones, metabolites, and molecules. So the gut microbiome can help with harvesting nutrients, and those molecules can also go through the blood. So the circulatory system or the blood could be another route by which molecules are going from the gut to the brain. And then
Really? It can go through our bloodstream?
Yes, definitely.
Wow.
So if you want to talk about neurotransmitters, for example, if you had gut microbes impacting digestion of various foods, and then the tryptophan amino acid in particular is altered in the blood, that tryptophan and other small amino acids like that can cross the blood-brain barrier. And the brain needs tryptophan to make serotonin, right? And serotonin's important in mood. And then there's also tyrosine, the amino acid that's a precursor to dopamine, that can also go that way. But it's important to know that serotonin and dopamine themselves do not cross the blood-brain barrier.
Okay. And I had often heard that serotonin is created in the gut. Is that correct?
Yes, most of the serotonin, yes, you're right. Most of the serotonin in your body is in the gut because it's produced, stored, and used in the gut for a variety of gut functions, including motility being one prime example.
Oh, interesting. So I think like when we take medications like an SSRI, which I know a lot of my listeners are familiar with, they're Prozacs and Zolofts and things like that. That's kind of one way of addressing a serotonin problem. But what you're saying is if we can treat the gut, that's also another way.
Yes, I think the challenge with many of these serotonin focused medications is that they're not specific. So, looking at depression and trying to address serotonin in the brain with a serotonin targeted drug would also then be affecting the serotonin in the intestine. And so that's why there are many of these side effects that happen that are gastrointestinal side effects with that. So there is an idea that if you could selectively target certain populations of serotonin in different parts of the body, then you could have more targeted effects. And a very interesting idea is targeting serotonin in the gut that then would bind to the serotonin receptors on the end of the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve uses a different neurotransmitter than to transmit to the brain, but that can actually also influence serotonin levels in the brain. So, but there are other ways to influence serotonin levels in the brain, like I told you about the tryptophan pathway, and probably others through the immune system. But this idea that in your gut, activities in your gut can affect your mood and affect your brain levels of serotonin is pretty powerful.
Wow. So now that people know this information, I know they're probably sitting there going, okay, well, that now I don't want to eat anything. I don't want to ingest anything that I don't know is going to help me. Because I know a lot of the parents of autistic children also have some serotonin issues or dopamine issues, or, whatever it may be. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, so to speak. So what can people start doing after learning that gut brain axis is so sensitive and crucial?
I think it depends on what your needs are, right? So if somebody does have a serotonin related issue, if it's serotonin syndrome, if it's depression, if it's anxiety, whatever it is, obviously consulting the right healthcare practitioner, the right doctor to help, who has a specialist and understands that area, it's very important. Some of them might not be aware of the influence of the gut microbiome. Some of them might not know about certain probiotics that can modulate serotonin in the brain. I don't know that I would be, the gut-brain axis is more of an, I would say it can be direct, but it can also be sort of indirect, right? The vagus nerve is kind of like that superhighway, and it can be very quick, but going through the bloodstream, waiting for all of that to happen and the brain to produce serotonin, that's a little bit slower. What we've seen with a specific example of the gut microbiome influencing brain serotonin specifically, just to get back to your point about sensitivity, when you look at the literature on plantarum PS128 specifically and how it modulated brain serotonin in preclinical studies, these weren't necessarily like huge changes, I would say. In the animal model, it would be like a maternal separation model, which was a depression model. The serotonin levels in the brain were then lower because it was a depression model. But then by adding the PS128, when the serotonin in the brain was increased, it didn't necessarily go above, like skyrocket above what you would consider normal for those mice. So I think, obviously, if you're going to take a probiotic or anything that could affect levels of brain serotonin and you're sensitive to serotonin, then you should always check with a healthcare practitioner before intervening with a dietary supplement or a dietary change or any extra medications that could potentially be doing similar things if you're already on medications that are influencing that serotonin pathway as well.
Oh, yes. That's a great point, because I think that we think of supplements and probiotics as being, harmless. So let me just kind of take them and see what happens. And, for some of them that might be true, but it sounds like the PS128 that Bened Life has designed is specifically formulated for autistic children, would you say?
Yeah, so the Mineralium P is the medical food specifically formulated for autistic people because of the 60 billion CFU of PS128 that it contains that was tested in autistic children. Now, I should point out, though, that in those clinical trials in PS128, there weren't any severe adverse effects or any severe adverse reactions. However, I would also say I don't believe there were any individuals with serotonin syndrome in those studies, right? And I don't think, although I might have to check, I don't think there were any individuals who were diagnosed with depression in those autistic children studies. But there are other studies using PS128 in depression with mixed results.
Okay, gotcha. So the PS128, if a parent wanted to give it a try, what age can they start giving it to their child?
PS128 has been used in children as young as 3. I mean, technically, the enrollment was 2.5 to 7, but there weren't that many children below 3. So that's probably the youngest that we would say for PS128.
Okay. And what chemically, what does the PS128 formula do for the brain and body?
So PS128 is a probiotic. It's a live microorganism. It's a biological organism. And in the preclinical studies, as I mentioned, PS128 can modulate, so balance dopamine and serotonin in the brain. It was shown in several different types of models where those neurotransmitters were affected, and then PS128 helped balance them out. So we believe that that's likely happening in human beings as well. And there are also some beneficial immune signaling properties that can be happening based on what we've seen in the preclinical studies. And what's interesting that I haven't said yet is that in some clinical studies of autistic people, they've seen L-plantarum at lower levels in the gut microbiome. So then you might imagine, well, could an L-plantarum probiotic be helpful to autistic people because it's lower in them? And then you'd find out, okay, well, which strain of L-plantarum would be beneficial, right? And PS128 is actually a strain of L-plantarum. So it's interesting that there's that overlap between this other finding in the literature and PS128 demonstrating some benefits to autistic people in 4 clinical trials.
Wow, that's interesting. What does L-plantarum do something in particular that, we've heard of lactobacillus, we've heard of, these, what is L-plantarum exactly?
Right. So lactobacillus is the genus, as I mentioned before, and then lactoplantibacillus is the new name of the genus, which plantarum is a species of. So,
Gotcha.
so think of like a big circle for lactobacillus, but now it's a big circle of lactoplantibacillus instead. And there's a smaller circle of plantarum inside that big circle. It's a subgroup. And then PS128 would be a smaller circle inside that. So it's a specific type of that type of bacteria. Plantarum usually comes from, plant. These are usually derived from plants. So PS128 was actually isolated from a spontaneous fermentation of a Taiwanese mustard green. And it's not found in all fermented foods or all fermented Taiwanese mustard greens, but this one was, just a sort of a spontaneous event. And then it was screened for different properties and found to have these effects later.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it seems as though many of our interventions are found in food.
Yes, that's right. I mean, look at it, lots of dietary supplements, lots of medical foods, lots of herbal products. Probiotics can be derived from fermented foods. But I should also point out that fermented foods themselves are not necessarily probiotics, because they might just, fermented foods technically, they contain live microbes, but they might not necessarily have been studied to have a specific benefit, whereas probiotics are specific live microbes that have been studied to show a specific benefit.
That's a really good point. And I noticed too on the Bened Life website, there is a lot of research, and it's legit research. Like when I like, there's lots of companies out there and websites out there that say, "Oh, we've researched this," and then you look at the research and it's okay. It's okay. You guys, your research is spot on. It's really great. I've looked through it on your website, and it just explains a lot of things that we go through as parents. What are some of the benefits you've seen in people that have given these to their children?
Sure. I've done some surveys of people taking the PS128 probiotic, and I've heard some wonderful testimonials. I think Izzy is probably the most amazing and wonderful example I'd like to talk about. He's a non-speaking autistic adult, and he was the first person to take PS128. His story comes primarily from his mother saying that they had done many different things and seen some benefits, but he was still stuck in his room counting DVDs. He was still having challenges putting on a new pair of shoes, having meltdowns there. So he was the first person to try PS128, and after a few months, it was incremental. It was slowly that he might start being around other people a little more, and then some months later, he had to get some new pair of shoes, and he was actually smiling coming home from that. And she has a picture of him with that event, smiling instead of having a meltdown. And then he's been on PS128 for many years now. I think it's about 10. And as a non-speaking individual, he's even communicated about this through text-to-speech apps at the Metamorphosis conference, and talked about how, like, without PS128, in his words, he would still be stuck in his room counting DVDs. So he suggested to others to try it at least.
My goodness. And that's amazing. And I'm familiar with the Metamorphosis conference. So we've had the Spelling to Communicate Elizabeth Bossler on our podcast as well. And we're in the process of currently teaching my son how to use spelling to communicate. So it's fascinating. Yeah. And I want to just say to parents out there, we've experienced similar times with my son where when we've treated the gut microbiome, we've seen gains in things that just don't even seem like they would be related, to pooping, right? For lack of a better word. But it's, when you think about the brain is connected to the rest of your body, right? And I see autism as a whole body disorder because often it's going to affect sleep. It's going to affect motor skills. It's going to affect motor planning. It's going to affect mood. I mean, it affects everything, which is why we parents are so exhausted. So I think, are there any downsides to just giving this a try? Are there side effects? Are there things parents need to know about? And does it require a prescription?
It does not require a prescription. When Izzy's mom was thinking about taking it, well, it's a probiotic. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? Like he poops more or something.
Yeah.
In the clinical trials on PS128, like I said, there haven't been severe adverse reactions. There haven't been serious side effects. Some people may have gastrointestinal disturbances, as with like practically any dietary change or any probiotic. There might be a little gas and bloating. There might be differences in intestinal habits. Usually with most probiotics that will subside soon. If it goes beyond like 2 weeks, that would be surprising, and maybe consider changing it up. That's something to discuss with a healthcare practitioner. Sometimes they recommend do 1 a day instead of 2 capsules a day, or I think, like I said before, if there are certain medications that are affecting serotonin and dopamine in the brain, we do know this probiotic can modulate that. So in rare cases, we have had some reports of people saying, "Oh, this really, had a big impact on me," and they discontinued it. So it's not necessarily for everyone, right? There's still so much research to be done. Everybody has different gut microbiomes, and there could be other things that are interacting or influencing that we don't know. But for like the majority of people and everybody that most people, they're seeing really great effects. And so some people are seeing actually improvements in their intestinal challenges, which wasn't necessarily our first expectation, but it's nice to see. And we've seen more, along the lines of the reduction in anxiety or improvements in communication. Some people have said that they have improvements in attention. Some of the testimonials also say that. So obviously, be mindful because, people can have a reaction to any kind of product out there, but the majority of people have not had issues. And like I said, the clinical trials didn't show anything severe.
Nice. I'm very impressed at also the way that you're going about things on your website. That just the idea of including autistic individuals and getting their feedback. I love that you had someone that spells to communicate or types to communicate, giving you feedback about this product when in the past they weren't able to do that. And that's just so. It gives me goosebumps. It's just really cool. What kind of research are you currently doing, or are you excited about that's coming up?
Thank you so much for asking that. We've been trying. It's been in the works. We've talked about this. We've been talking to different people. We've been looking at other experts' examples, and I'm really excited when we can finally launch the studies. We do have a study, I believe, we might launch it this year. I don't want to talk too much, right? Because you want to wait till something is like an IRB approved protocol and that you're actually enrolling people. We want to have a study in autistic people that really looks at outcomes that autistic people have defined. So our first step really, I think, is to launch a survey that autistic people, even non-speaking autistic people who can spell to communicate or just basically fill out an online survey for us, tell us what are the outcomes that are most interesting to you? What is really something that you want help with? And what do you need in terms of modifying a survey? We've seen some other groups out there who might modify a survey that was validated and used maybe even in autistic people before, but some autistic people might find it more accessible or more reflective of their experience if you changed some wording or if you approached it in a different way. So first, we want to do that groundwork, get that information to understand what are the outcomes that are important before we design a clinical trial. And then we need to set up that infrastructure to design the clinical trial. And I hope we can get one in the works later this year. And next year, there's a few different options. If people listening are interested in something like that, they could reach out to our customer happiness team, because I don't have a better contact at the moment. But I do hope we will have something on our website in the future that people could click on and say, like, I'd be interested in helping with research.
Yeah, that's awesome. What do you feel like, Dr. Noelle, is the best part of your job?
The best part. I mean, the best part is learning from so many people's different experiences as well as the literature. I mean, it's usually I read a lot of literature and I enjoy talking to fellow researchers and learning about new ideas and new information. But it's been so amazing. I had the pleasure to actually go to Monomorphosis conference, and it was so powerful to witness Izzy's presentation. He was sitting there and the presentation was coming over. It was a video with his words being spoken by some text-to-speech app, but he had already prepared it in advance, and he was sitting up there with his mom, and it was just so amazing. That he's been involved in a lot of research himself, and it's exciting to really see that and meet the real people who are benefiting from a probiotic that, I mean, I heard about this probiotic many years ago, and I thought, really, a probiotic could affect serotonin and dopamine in the brain? And the more I get into it, it's very interesting to see and hear more testimonials from people when people submit testimonials about the amazing experiences they've had. And it might take 6 months for some people, but it's been really a pleasure to hear the real stories from real people.
Oh, that's just so heartwarming. Thank you for sharing that. I want to be mindful of your time. What else do you feel like people need to know about probiotics and the gut-brain connection that we haven't covered?
The field is so huge. It's hard to cover it all. I didn't even talk about germ-free mice and how we've learned so much from, raising animals without microbes to figure out like what does that do to the immune system, to the brain, everything. But as far as what's applicable to people that they can take away, probiotics, they have strain-specific effects, right? So you want to look for that it's what's the strain, what's the benefit, is it going to have the same CFU throughout the same amount of living microbes throughout the shelf life of that product? What are the storage conditions so you can maintain that live microbes amount? And then are you taking it for what you want to take it for, like for the outcome that you wanted? And then medical foods are different than dietary supplements. Dietary supplements are for specific health outcomes, they might have different amounts and types of ingredients, whereas a medical food is specifically for the dietary management of a condition.
Oh, that's a good point, because you mentioned that this product has a medical food in it.
So Neuralium P is a medical food. So that's the 60 billion CFU PS128 for autistic people, for example.
Okay, got it, got it. And so you're saying the difference is that one is feeding the gut and one is not, or what would you say the difference is there?
It's usually a matter of amount. So
Gotcha.
and the type of formula, right? So the PS128 at 60 billion CFU was studied to show benefits in autistic people, but PS128 has been studied at different amounts in other populations for different aspects as well.
Gotcha, gotcha. So the amounts will be different related to what you're trying to treat or the benefit you're trying to get.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what I've learned is this is really, really complicated. And so leaving the research to you is a great idea. I think that, and this is what I want to ask you as the last question for today. There's so much information out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much misinformation out there. And then there's so much really legit research that isn't getting the attention that it should be getting.
Mm-hmm.
All that being said, what should people be looking for? What does it look like to be a smart consumer nowadays with supplements, probiotics, and all of that? What should we know?
Yeah, it's pretty challenging. I think there's a few different ways to approach looking for natural health products, looking for dietary supplements, medical foods, etc. It's not always easy, even for the research to be easily findable as well. But for example, like with PS128, you could look at it independently off the Bennett Life website to find out more information about it as well. But it can be hard because you don't have the time to do all that research yourself. I mean, I've looked at products for other situations, and you don't have time to go through everything. One approach that many people take is going to a good healthcare practitioner, a functional medicine practitioner, somebody who could recommend a product or multiple products for all the different aspects. Because like we said earlier, you may need to look at so many different things besides the gut microbiome, or besides the gut-brain axis, besides a probiotic, to help with the different things you need. But just following you're looking for quality. Obviously, you're looking for the research. You're looking for real people. I mean, I think nowadays, like if it looks AI generated, you need to really establish that there's real people behind what you're looking at, and is what they're saying consistent with what maybe some experts are saying in the field of probiotics or botanicals or whatever field you're looking at. You want to see that reflected in some of these third-party experts, like I mentioned, ISAP, for example. And once you see that sort of consistency across, the authority, and then you could also see peer examples of real people having results, like I mentioned, or like other people. Some people might tell other people, like, oh, this product worked great for me. That, so then when you have multiple things that sort of help triangulate you into that same direction, then you can have more confidence with all of those different pieces of evidence.
Yeah, I love that. So, so just for our listening audience, these guys are the real deal. Check it out at benedlife.com.
That's right.
Okay. And I'll be linking to everything in the show notes today. I know we got a little scientific. That's where I like to go. So hopefully brought you back around. Dr. Noelle, I do want to ask one last question that I ask everybody, and I'm going to ask you as well. If every autism parent in the world were listening, what would you want them to know?
Your presence to your child, listening to them, I think, is probably one of the biggest gifts you can start to give them. And from there, you can identify what their needs are and then try everything you can to uncover the gifts and talents they have and support them with just anything that they need to thrive and survive.
That's beautiful. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Noelle, for coming and being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this really interesting, packed episode. Just a few takeaways that I had. I've been in the biomedical world since my son was first diagnosed. And I'm just so excited that there is so much more research out there in this area, not only for our kids with autism, but for ourselves. That gut-brain connection is important for all of us, particularly for the parents that are taking care of our children every day. As a caregiver, the stress can really mess with your biochemistry if we're not eating healthy foods, like Dr. Patno was saying, if we're eating too much sugar, if we're overly stressed, if we're not getting enough sleep. All of these things can affect our gut biome. And sometimes the key is pretty simple: finding the right probiotic, the right good bacteria to go back into our bodies. So I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. It was just a delight to get to know Dr. Patno. And if you want more information, all of that information is in our show notes. If you'd like to join our Patreon, that information is also in our show notes, where you can connect with other parents, other professionals, and get more information about our guests and our special offerings. And we'd love to see you there. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you enjoyed this show, please like it wherever you subscribe to your podcasts and share with your friends.
The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional.